This episode is brought to you by Active Digital, where we help customer-obsessed companies become destination brands.
He stands up, and then the rest of his team, and this is the prospect, they all stand up at the same time, and he walks to the whiteboard, and he just writes a number on the board, and he walks out of the room, and he says, "We'll be back in 10 minutes. Like, you guys either accept or you don't."
So today, we're talking about the book Getting Naked by Patrick Lencioni and all of the things that we learned from that book that really resonate with us that we want to help you apply to your business. Do you want to decommoditize your products and services? Do you want to become a destination brand, increase your revenue, and have more control over your pricing? You're in the right place. Each week, we'll talk about how to create great customer experiences and how to orient your company to enable them. We're your hosts, Devin and David, and this is the Experience Leader Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Back again with my brother David. How you doing, man?
Oh man, it's another good day to be alive, Devin.
All right, man. Today we are talking about our first book review on the show here. We're reviewing Getting Naked by Patrick Lencioni. It's kind of a business fable is the way that Patrick describes it. It really goes through talking about business principles by actually using fiction, which I think is really cool. I think that some of the ways that this book impacted me. One, it validated things that I have kind of held to about business for a long time, and so to have somebody write it into really a fictional narrative form, and to talk about it that way was super powerful for me. Obviously, one of the things we know is that stories are some of the most powerful ways to communicate anything. And so that really can stick with a person. If you've got an hour-long speech and you've got one story in there, the story is the thing they're probably going to remember. And so I love the fact that Patrick decided to go the route of writing it as a fictional narrative. The other side of it has just been, me looking at that and thinking, I want to be able to, one, work at a company that operates this way. Two, I want to help my clients operate this way. What was your experience reading the book, David?
Yeah, man. I mean, I think back to in the more technical world, like the Phoenix Project is has a very similar format in the sense that its purpose was to kind of roll through DevOps in a way that was, matched to a story that people could consume and allows you to kind of see the why behind it versus just the mechanics. And so I'm always a fan of this format. I think it's cool to be able to use storytelling in that way to walk folks through it. The thing that I was curious about for myself, having, I'm in the consulting world, having been in that world for a while, is the example that he chose to use was a management consultancy, and so there was a part of that can go one of two ways sometimes, right? It's either cool, this resonates with me and I dig it, or it doesn't resonate because it doesn't feel the same as my world, in which case, like, I'm done reading. Right. For me, it was very much the former, though. I think it was kind of just like a double bonus that it was like, yeah, this is I'm seeing where he's going with this. I'm actually really into the story, like read it cover to cover. But also, it just so happens to be in the field that I've been in for a long time. I know that you've been in, that we're in together now, and so it was kind of cool to have that as well, where it's like, yeah, this is a 1-to-1 to be able to pull some lessons from.
Yeah. It felt good to read that, obviously, because it applies so directly to what we're doing. So it impacted us that way. One of the things that Patrick points out in the book is that it applies to any business. And you'll see as we kind of talk through, some of the big takeaways that we got from this that Patrick highlights. Those things apply to any business anywhere, because it's really about one, how you are treating people. Almost all these things can be broken down into how you're treating people, which is, it's a common theme here on the show. It's always a common theme. It's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to treat people better, so we earn the business. But the other side of that is honestly how to operate your business in a way that allows you to stand on your principles. And I rest on the fact that if we do those things, the outcomes will come. And the principles here really are reinforcing that. Operate off of the principles, the outcomes will come. And it's to stop us from doing things that can be natural reactions that are actually counterproductive to the outcomes that we want to get. So I kind of want to hop into the first one here. We've got two things we want to cover that Patrick goes into. He talks about the three fears, essentially: the fear of losing the business, the fear of being embarrassed, and the fear of feeling inferior. If you think about it, these are things that we deal with just in personal interaction,
Yeah,
right? Like,
absolutely.
That's really what this stuff is, and we carry that into our business, and it can wreak all kinds of havoc. These three fears can wreak all kinds of havoc inside and outside of your company. So, I love some of your thoughts on this, David. I want to kind of hand it to you first on talking about the fear of losing the business. Like, talk about, kind of the risks, of that behavior.
I mean, for me, I've seen this, and I think a lot of us have, I've seen this in all types of organizations, right? You look at a startup software company and just the desperation of landing customers and what it takes to hold on to them and what that can do to culture in terms of we can't possibly afford to not have this customer. So I'm going to, purposely act in a specific way that's probably a bit counter to what would have been natural and what would have been, vulnerable. Right.
Yeah.
You see it at in some of the biggest organizations in the world, some of which I've worked with, and whether that's in them attempting to hold on to a product or a service that frankly has been around for too long, but they're too afraid to kind of mess with it in a specific way, and so frankly, there's an inauthentic relationship between that product or service and the customers that are using it, but they're just holding on for dear life, and so you see this in a bunch of different scenarios, but the big risk there, and frankly, even the small risk there to not even go nuclear with it yet, but like at the lowest level, the thing that's almost assured when you start going down the path of operating in fear of losing the business as an organization is that you're kind of you're capping the trust between you and your customer, right? Cutting it off at the knees, really. And when you do that, you're effectively saying, you're not only saying like this is where it stops. In other words, like we've reached the pinnacle at best. But you're effectively kind of putting the train on a downward trajectory towards we're headed to a bad spot. And ironically, by you not being vulnerable in the moment, when you can be, you're effectively creating vulnerabilities for your organization that easily allow somebody else to swoop in and frankly take the business out from underneath you. Happens every time.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've noticed, and I've said this to people in all kinds of contexts, but really, the core of trust is vulnerability. It was amazing for me to read that in the book because I had said that to people years before I ever read this book. But I just realized in personal relationships, the core to building trust is mutual vulnerability. If one person is not willing to be vulnerable, it shows that they don't trust you enough, or you don't trust them enough in order to kind of show the cards. And if you don't do that, like you said, it caps where you can go. Mm-hmm. It caps where the relationship can go because the other person's only going to be willing to let you in as much as you do them, or it's a lopsided relationship and it's not going to work. You're kind of sending it towards, all right, this is not going to last. You're kind of indicating the end, the moment that you decide that you're going to do that when it is inappropriate for you to withhold vulnerability.
100%. And, customers see through that, right? They see through the, okay, well, you didn't say that, and I'm pretty sure you should have, or you said something, but the truth is, like, I can tell that you're thinking something else that you're not telling me because you don't think that I want to hear that, or you don't think the timing is right. And, when customers see through that, it creates this, it starts to create breaks in the relationship that are difficult to patch up, because that's foundational stuff, right? You move on, or you move beyond kind of the transactional into foundational pieces of the partnership that are then difficult to patch up after the fact. The transactional stuff you can always, it's kind of the point, right? Is that in a transaction, in a conversation, in solving a specific problem, if you approach that in a way that is thinking about what your customer is attempting to achieve, and frankly, being vulnerable enough, as you pointed out, being vulnerable enough to say, hey, like, actually, we got that wrong 10 minutes ago when we talked about that. Like, let's reset, because this doesn't feel like we're headed down the right path. Versus, I'm going to keep my mouth shut because I already said one thing, and I'm pretty scared that if I say the other thing, they're going to think that maybe now I don't know what I'm talking about. And then, and we'll talk a little bit about, sort of those types of fears as well. But it all comes down to, if I am not saying a thing, or I'm withholding, or I'm, sort of modifying in some way, specifically as to not lose the game, like, again, the great irony is, like, I'm probably going to lose the game. I'll never, like, this is an image. Well, it's actually a series of images because it happens so many times, but I grew up in Pittsburgh, Steelers fan. The Steelers, I don't know, maybe my dad just over-indexed on this, but in my head, they were just notorious for prevent defense always. So the Steelers would take the lead, go into prevent defense. And my father, that was the thing that set him off, so you're in the fourth quarter and his whole thing was like, you're trying not to lose, and this is what's going to make us lose the game. Every time I can just, I can still picture my dad kind of yelling at the TV and saying that. But, it's the business version of that, right? Which is like, if you're trying not to lose, everyone sees what's going on, and they will continue to hit you with 15-yard outs until they score a touchdown, like every time.
That's right, man. That's exactly right. I can think back to, any sort of competitive thing that I've done. As soon as I start playing not to lose, I wind up beginning to give ground.
Yeah.
The moment that I start playing that way, I start to give ground, because the way that you win is by being willing to take risks in order to gain ground. And so that risk, right, we consider that, that honesty, that vulnerability, we consider that a risk. It's actually risky to do the other thing. It's risky to try to hide that stuff, because most of us aren't good at it. Most of us aren't.
Because you change you're playing poker now, and most people frankly kind of suck at poker. And so, it's, and it's that, right. You're playing a completely different game.
Yeah.
And the core of that from an external standpoint is, you are, by definition, you are no longer considering your customer's outcome as the central piece, to the story, right? You have now inserted this other objective, which is, we need to make sure that they don't fire us. And that's just a different conversation. And it isn't one that engenders a lot of the things that we have talked about and will continue to talk about in this forum around how you actually build longstanding relationships that are partnerships that create fans out of your customers and all that good stuff. Like, I can promise you, like, none of that comes from creating a situation where your main objective is not to get fired.
Absolutely. I've seen it happen before, and people pick up on that. Anybody listening or watching this right now knows, you can think back. You're probably thinking back right now to situations where you were dealing with folks who clearly were thinking about how to make sure that they kept your dollars coming in, that they did not have your best interests in mind. They were just trying to hold on to that revenue, and it kills the relationship instantly. It destroys trust. It destroys willingness to continue upping the ante, because you're now concerned that this person's not really thinking about me. No, I've got to watch out to make sure I don't get hurt here, that I don't get damaged. And so, we can think of any number of situations, where that's happened. And, I've worked in client service, and, service-based business, professional services for most of my career. I can think to conference room meetings where, or meetings I wasn't a part of, where I heard the decision after the fact. And I was like, we literally did that just to try to save the account. We allowed ourselves to, one, either get stepped on, or we didn't tell them what they needed to hear. We didn't tell them the truth because we were afraid of losing the business. That stuff right there, it always comes around and winds up losing you the business.
It does. And you hit on, the other side of this, which is internally to your organization, just from a culture standpoint, you have to make a choice as a business. You have to choose how you're going to view failure, right? And that's a bigger topic, and we can spend a lot of time on that, and we probably will spend some time on that. But you have to choose how you're going to define failure is probably a better way to put it. And what that actually means, right? And so if your orientation is around outcomes for your customer, then failure also needs to be put in the context of what your customers were able to achieve or not. And even then, I think there's a healthy way to look at that. But if you set the goalpost somewhat differently, right? If you change the rules of the game a bit, and now failure, and now you have kind of there's this double whammy that occurs sometimes where one, failure is viewed as, well, we thought we would do X, but we did 0.75X, fail. And then don't ever let that happen again. Like, do whatever you have to do to not make that happen. If that becomes the culture, it results in decisions that everyone kind of turns their head to the side a little bit. In product companies, a lot of times that can result in roadmaps that just get all out of whack, right? Yep. Because, you had, to your point, there's kind of different versions of what can cause this, but you might have a request that comes in that everybody knows is not in the best interest of the product. It's probably not even in the best interest of the client, but they're adamant. And you have two choices, right? You either stand up to them and kind of explain why the roadmap might look a little bit different than what they're suggesting, but here's the path to get to what they're achieving, which is really the important thing. Or, you have other cases where it's not necessarily that the client is asking for something specific, but, like you were saying, there's a hard truth that needs to be spoken. And the time to do that is maybe right now. And again, internally within your organization, the culture of you speak the hard truths when you need to, because that's how, and, there's all kinds of nice long tail of this, but like that's how you build trust. And frankly, like that's where you innovate with your customers, is in those moments, in the hard moments. Or your culture says, listen, like we do not make customers angry. We do not ever say anything that's going to cause them to become upset or to, like we've got to stick to the script, even if we know the script is wrong, like, all that stuff like that. That's the opposite of innovation, right?
Absolutely.
That's just staying the course.
That's it. It's one, kind of going to smack around, one of the sayings that we always hear, and I'm not the first to smack this saying around, but it needs some more smacking around. The customer is always right thing. That is not actually in the best interest of the customer. The customer is always right. The way that winds up getting acted out usually is not actually in the best interest of the customer, and therefore not in the best interest of the business. And that phrase is so often kind of turned around anyway to be an excuse for we'll do anything for revenue, right? In the name of the customer. That's right. And that's where it's particularly dangerous, right? I mean, I think anyone listening to this knows that you and I have a very specific view on what it means to serve your customers, right? And so it's not about like, oh, the customer isn't important. It's quite the opposite. However, we see so many organizations where they have taken that
phrase as as trying to sound customer first, but really all they're saying is, yeah, we're going to do whatever they say if they keep writing checks. And we're going to sort of, look the other way with the fact that we're also eroding things on our side, which is ultimately going to have, downstream impacts that we'll worry about later, I guess.
Exactly. And I've seen those downstream impacts.
Yeah.
I've seen them. I've seen with the relationship, with the revenue.
Yeah.
Right. Not like, so the relationship, you kept the account. Okay. They don't respect you anymore. Cause they know that you did that. Yeah. Right. And two, revenue's also winding up getting impacted in a way that you didn't want to. So
no doubt.
I've seen it happen before, and you've got to be able to say in a certain moment, like, listen, they might not like what I have to hear. It's one of the things that happened in the book. One of the instances where the consultant basically told his client, "Hey, that marketing campaign sucks." You know that it sucks too.
Yep.
You're just not willing to admit that. And when I read that, I was like, man, would I have the guts to just go ahead and say, and the client, protested at first, mm-hmm. and consultant doesn't back down. And I thought to myself, like, would I have the guts to say that, right? Like, even on a product company side, you've got people coming with feature requests. You've got people coming and complaining about things and saying things are bugs, right? Well, it's not really a bug. It's that you want this to do something that it doesn't do. And you go and you actually dig into it, and it's like, well, you want the product to do this thing, because the way that you're operating isn't the best. But, a lot of times we don't, people don't want to get into that conversation with the customer. They don't want to say, like,
yep.
Hey, here's a better way to do this. Instead of having the product do this thing, we highly recommend that you operate this way, right? If you're talking to a consumer, those discussions can be difficult, right? I've been in the B2C world, and obviously that when you're B2C, you're operating at a much larger scale. It's harder to have those individual conversations. Obviously, if you're staffed for it, great, right? If you're staffed for it, which just a quick plug. That is one of the things that will build trust very quickly, is if you actually staff to be able to support, if you're in B2C, staff to be able to support that stuff, people will respect you and love you for it. If you take that seriously. It's one of the things I see lacking in the age of the SaaS and software age is that lack of support. But when you actually are able to work with people to say, here's actually potentially a better way to do this thing. That's not always an easy conversation. And you're thinking, especially as if you're your customer service rep, you're thinking, well, like, if I lose this customer, my incentives go down, et cetera. There's all kinds of things operationally you got to put in place, and culturally you have to put in place to give that person the leeway to be honest with the customer.
Yep.
All kinds of stuff you have to do as a leader to be able to set that person up to be able to be honest.
That is exactly right. And we'll talk about this a little bit, but it's, you've said this a bunch of times and I like it. Like, none of these things, when we talk about addressing these types of fears, we talk about vulnerability, patterns and cultural elements to all of this. None of that gives you the excuse not to be great, right? You still have to know what you're doing, because, and you kind of called it out. There's an enablement piece when it comes to these touch points with the customer, but there's also confidence from the business side, and that translates down to the individual level. There's confidence that is necessary to say, I'm going to give you the hard news. However, we have also thought through why the hard news also has, kind of a plan of action attached to it, right? And that second part is as important as the first, right? I mean, you also don't want to just run around, ringing the bell and telling everybody they're screwed up, right? Like that's not helpful to anybody, right? Like thank you, we're aware. It's actually why we hired you, right? So like being great at what you do, being excellent is still in the equation for all of this,
Right.
So yeah, and it's a both and, right? For sure.
Totally. And I mean, so that they're obviously you want to be great. We need to focus on being great so that people still want to pull our product or our service into their lives. You want to be able to be honest. You want to be able to be vulnerable to build that human connection, because the human connection works the same. I'm going to repeat myself a lot because we need to hear these things multiple times, but that human connection is the same, whether it's person to person or person to business, because it's just a bunch of people running a business. We have to treat it the same way. The companies that figure that out do very well, right? When you're talking about being vulnerable, there's a fear of being embarrassed. Right? Kind of jumping into the next fear here. The fear of being embarrassed by, hey, maybe you did screw up. Maybe there's a moment you work great. How do you deal with that? I would love to kind of hear your thoughts on how you handle that in a way that builds connection as opposed to destroy it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, the nice thing about, and really, this book did a great job of showcasing some of the interplay between a lot of these topics, right? Because even when we're talking about specific fears, none of this stuff is siloed, right? Fear of losing the business oftentimes includes, an element of maybe being embarrassed, right? It includes an element of, maybe asking silly questions and not, and so when you get into it, these things often layer on top of each other. And so, when I think about how to get comfortable with being embarrassed.
Right.
If that's the right way to put it, I think that, a lot of that comes from having confidence as an individual and as an organization, having confidence that you're coming from the right place. And there's an empathetic component to that. So the human to human piece and really understanding like, hey, I'm going to have this conversation with you because maybe I don't understand something. Maybe I feel like we're on the wrong path. And when I say we, that might be my fault or my team's fault, right? But I'm going to do it because I feel like it's the right point in our relationship to have that discussion such that we can continue to serve you in the right way, Mr. Customer or Mrs. Customer. And I think when you're coming from the right place, I don't see that as then being embarrassed, right? And I'm not discounting the fact that, like, let's call it what it is. Like, your tail is probably between your legs. Like, listen, maybe you screwed up. It happens. But it also, it's more important. It's not just this is just as important, but it's more important to look at what you did with that. And again, I think that if you view that in that lens, and to tie into, one of the things we were just talking about, and culturally, you are a part of a team that allows you to kind of stumble a little bit and jump back up because you're defining success in such a way that it's okay to take a left turn as long as everything you're doing is marching towards the customer achieving their outcomes, which is why they hired you in the first place, right? Or why they hired your product in the first place. That's really the bedrock, right? That keeps the trust intact. It keeps the partnership intact, and it keeps you out of that danger zone of, all right, now they're kind of starting to see through. I tend to, you see it a lot. I've seen this at some of the, frankly, like even some of the highest functioning companies in the world, where even then you can tell when people are like, wow, you're all in on that idea. And I saw a certain energy, but then when we got to that other topic, like you didn't let on that you don't understand that quite as well, which frankly would have been useful because it would have opened up discussion around that and we maybe could have gotten somewhere. You just changed your energy and avoided it. And we all saw it, right? And you can see that in people where it's like, all right, like I'm gonna let you finish, but like like, to quote the great Kanye, right? Like I'm gonna let you finish, but I think we all know what's being said right here, and that it does. It erodes confidence, and it also shuts down the conversation for others to weigh in, because you have not opened the door for somebody else to weigh in and say, oh, like you're struggling with that. Let me explain to you what that actually is. And now we can move on and be productive, versus like, all right, boss man's not talking about it, so we're not talking about it. So I guess we're all just going to go back to our offices and pretend like that didn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the whole thing is, people aren't stupid, right? Like that. I mean, to say, put it out there, people aren't dumb. That's one of the things that I've learned over the years is everybody's just about as smart as you think you are. We kind of think like, oh, right, okay, I think I handled that. Like they didn't pick up on that. No, they did.
Yeah, they did.
They picked up on it. So the better thing to do is to own it. Don't double down on it. Don't try to cover it up. I'll never forget. I was working at an agency, and we were bidding on national well-known fast food chain. We were in the running to become agency of record. And another very well-known fast food chain had just released, something new on their menu, and I was kind of addicted to it at the time. I was working late, this is back in my days of doing front-end development. I'm there late. My wife is bringing me food because I'm working late, and I forget that the pitch is happening, maybe 30 to 50 feet away from my cube. And I bought another company's fast food.
Yep.
And not thinking about it, because I'm thinking like I'm just trying to get this code written. And I go let my wife in. We're coming off of the elevator. The elevator doors open up, and there are 3 executives from our company and 3 executives from the prospects company waiting outside the elevator. And I'm double fisting giant large drinks from this other place. And I remember seeing one of our execs' eyes just go wide, and she's like, hide it. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no hiding this. Like this is
these do not fit in a bag.
Yeah. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So we, my wife and I are like completely just utterly embarrassed. I know that our people were embarrassed.
Yeah.
I'm sure that the other folks thought it was funny,
right.
Which, I apologize, because one of those execs that was outside the elevator was the president of our company. And I apologized, and he told me not to worry about it, but he had that natural way of just kind of laughing that stuff off and not turning it into a thing, just being like, stuff happens. But I remember in that moment, my reaction internally, just in the milliseconds of me seeing that scene unfold as those elevator doors opened.
Yep.
And the milliseconds that passed, that felt like eternity. The thought of, once I heard that one exec say, hide it. And I'm thinking to myself, that's the wrong move right now.
Yep.
These people aren't dumb. Like, we're all seeing the same images. Like, what what am I going to do here? You just got to own it at that point,
Own it, don't hide it. Yep.
Yeah. The better thing would have been for me to not be an idiot and order somebody else's food the same night we were pitching a multi-million-dollar account. But in that moment, you got to own it. And so, we eventually, the funny thing is that we eventually wound up doing business with them. I think it was after I had actually moved on. But we wound up doing business with that company. And I'm pretty proud of the work that they were doing for them. But it comes from just being real, being real. Yeah. So I want to touch on the last thing here. I want to touch on, the fear of feeling inferior.
Mm-hmm.
worry that we have that, somebody clearly knows more than we do in a particular area. We think we're coming in and we're supposed to have all the answers, right?
Yep.
And somebody clearly demonstrates that they have a lot of depth in a particular area, and we're worried now that we look like we don't deserve to be in the room. Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts on that, man.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's probably foundational to that feeling, and this is, ego plays a role in all of these, but as an individual, as an organization, when you start saying those words or thinking those thoughts, right, of we feel, I feel, we feel, I feel, you're already in a mindset that, you're bringing in some selfishness, you're bringing in the ego to the equation, right? And so it's no longer about, yeah, okay, you feel inferior, but are you actually the star of the show? Like that because you're putting yourself at that point, you're putting yourself kind of in the center of everything and saying like, the most important thing right now is that I feel inferior. Right. And for anyone, right, that's watching that movie from afar, like you are not the star of the show. And like, let's be honest, like nobody cares. Right. And not in some sort of negative way, like you shouldn't feel those things. It's human. Right. But in the, like, put it in context. Right. And I think, part of that, and this, I do a lot of advising on the startup side, product companies, some of which are in very niche industries, some of which aren't. But you'll see this funny thing happen, especially in technology, and technology that's being applied to legacy industries, right? So when you kind of see these disruptor patterns come in, where there's a group, that's building software, and is legitimately expert at what they're doing. And let's, for the sake of argument, let's assume that they've actually found really great product market fit with this thing that they want to go do. Right. And so at one point in the journey early on, they're feeling very good about that. They've kind of they've built their thesis around, if we can build this for this market, this is, all the things you do to kind of play it out. And it feels wonderful. And but they may not, they might not have spent the last 30 years in that industry, right? So there is a gap there. And so you start going to market and you end up with kind of this, like, it's almost like crosstalk with the inferiority complex, right? Where the vendor is feeling inferior about the market because they're getting poked at, which, by the way, happens all the time. That's called business, right? People generally ask questions before they buy. So, the vendor starts to feel a little bit inferior. But then on the flip side, you have prospective clients or clients who are feeling inferior themselves. They're feeling insecure because this technology that they are considering, they don't understand it. And they don't know how to verbalize that without feeling like, without feeling less than. And so you have this like terrible pattern where one side is feeling, insecure about their lack of knowledge. The other side is feeling insecure. No one's going to show their cards. And you end up with some really, frankly, like nasty conclusions, right? Sometimes you just don't win the business because you can't bridge that chasm never gets crossed, right? And so you're just never speaking the same language. Sometimes you bridge it superficially, but again, like not addressing core issues, simple stuff. I mean, this, it's generally, like I've literally been in rooms where there is an acronym on the board and I don't know what it means. I am sure that no one on my team knows what it means. And we just don't say anything and you just roll with it. And we come out of that meeting and it's like, okay, that's a part of the scope. And it's like, what did we just agree to? Right. Like, all you have to do is ask, but you don't, because you don't want to, you don't want to look like a dummy and you don't want to, and on the other side, we just demoed the product. They probably got 50% of it. And the other 50% was probably just a blur. It would have been real nice if they raised their hand and said, hey, like that screen, can you show that to me again? Like I've got to communicate this to, the main buyer. And I don't think that I can do that based on what you just showed me. Like I need a better walkthrough. But they don't want to look that way. And so what do you end up with? You've got one side that just committed to build an XYZ, whatever that is, right? And then you've got, some somebody that's got to go to their boss and explain to them what they just saw, even though they have no idea what they just saw, but they're pretty sure they need it, which that's a great conversation. This is the silliness that happens, though. But all of it is rooted in ego, and it's rooted in, kind of just this, like, I'm afraid to ask the one question that I need to ask in order to, I might get all of it, but one thing, like, just ask. Just ask. Just say it.
Absolutely. That's, I remember being at one company, a big bank. I remember being there and being in a meeting, and we're all, we're all talking about how to do this thing, and I hear them. I was relatively new, and I'm hearing them tossing around this acronym, and so I was like, okay, I don't know what this means. I've been here for probably about 6 months. I still don't know what this acronym means. I've never really asked anybody, but everybody else seems to know what it is. But it's going to come up eventually when I got to work on this that I don't know what it means. So I'm just going to ask. Like, I had one of those moments where I was like, you know what? I'm going to stop pretending.
Yeah.
Like I know what this means, and I'm just going to ask. And I remember, I'll never forget, I asked the question, hey, what does this mean? What does it stand for? And they said, I don't know. Everybody
said, I don't know.
I don't know. Yep. The people that had been there for years said, I don't know. And so the thing, I was terrified of asking for months.
Yeah.
I was terrified of asking what it meant. And then eventually when I did it, turns out everybody in the room doesn't know.
Yeah.
I've, been in situations where, you're dealing with a customer, and you're incredibly afraid in front of the customer when they say something, and you're kind of being brought in to help them do whatever it is, right? And they say an acronym, they say a term, they say something you don't know what it means. And it's that inferiority complex, again, goes to ego, goes to you wanting to look smart, goes back to fear of losing the business.
Yep. No doubt.
You don't want to ask the question. I think almost every single time.
Yeah.
Every single time that I've had the courage to ask the question, somebody else in the room was glad I asked.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no doubt. And we'll talk about this as we, maybe like next episode, as we dig into some of the principles. We'll talk about this some more from the same book, because I think he does a good job of kind of laying some of this out. But, one of the key parts there too is the impact that it can have on others in the room, others on your team, on your client, and the temporal nature of that. Like you pointed out that it was months, which is often the case. So there's this sort of, negative compounding effect of, like, the longer you don't say something, the longer people are operating with missing information, which is a problem. It also, you start to feel more inferior as it's like if you're trying to pick up golf, like if you just started when it was just you and your buddy and neither one of you knew how to play, it would have been all right. But now you waited 2 years and your buddy's pretty good. Now you really don't want to get out on the course, right? So it's like, by waiting, you made it worse, right? Because now it's like, well, you wouldn't have actually looked foolish had you jumped in when you could have. But now, this is a very personal story for me right now, because I'm like, man, that's a game. Like I'm not good at losing, and like that's what I'm going to lose at for a while. But I definitely think that, like, when you're absolutely there. Right? Like, when you look back on, I'll tell one story that's like it's related from a communication standpoint and maybe inferiority standpoint. But I had this is going back some years, but big European utility company, and we were pitching what was, for me at the time, like probably the biggest deal that I've ever pitched. And we had been going back and forth for a couple of weeks, not in person, and got to the point where it was like, okay, I think we've been down selected. This is kind of our moment to close the deal. So fly out to where they were and get in the room, and we have a discussion, kind of narrowed down some scope stuff. And it's like, it's time to just figure out what the number is, and feeling good, because it's like, we're going to get this business and this is amazing. And the guy does something that I just didn't expect, to the point where it threw me off so much that I just froze when he did it. But he stands up, and then the rest of his team, and this is the prospect, they all stand up at the same time, and he walks to the whiteboard and he just writes a number on the board, and he walks out of the room and he says, "We'll be back in 10 minutes. Like, you guys either accept or you don't." And there's a number on the board. And we've been talking for weeks. Like, this is not this wasn't some like faceless, RFP where they never met us and they were just kind of like trying to be standard. Like, this was just like a really weird tactic. So I'm in there with only one colleague who is equally as awestruck, and he's from that country. And I'm like, dude, like, you need to help me out here. Like, culturally, what am I missing? So we're staring at the board, staring at each other. And it's like, all right, I guess we need to make a call, and this is a big number, and it's a big thing that we're signing up for. And so they come back in, and it turns out like the number was close enough that it was okay. So they come back in, and I caveat a little bit before I say yes, but we say yes, and I'm like, and I finally did at least work up the courage to ask this question, which is like, why did you do that? And the answer was, we thought. So at the time I was living in the UK, but still very obviously an American. Like, we thought that was the best way to work with you, because like generally what we've heard, and I don't think they'd ever done this before, but like what they had heard or watched in a movie or so, I don't even know what the deal was, but like they had just heard that was the right way to negotiate with an American, was to just throw a number on the board. And so like here they are. The only reason they did that is because they thought I wanted it done that way. Meanwhile, I am like sweating like nothing because I have no idea what to do with this number on the board, right? Because I thought that we would be normal and we could have a conversation. So just another great example of like, I should have just been like, yo, like, why are we doing this? Like, but just stood there silent, said yes. And it wasn't until after the fact that, so just all those moments where, you have opportunities to just be vulnerable and be like, guys, like, I like y'all and I think we're going to do business together, but why did you just do that thing? And what are you expecting me to do with it? So yeah, it happens all the time in business. Yeah. They're like, I can't believe we have to do this nonsense for this knucklehead that's in here. And it's like, and they're probably feeling inferior to the point of like, well, if we do it the normal way, like this guy's not going to respect us. So we got to do it his way, Oh man, the funniness that happens like, in these relationships, but it does come down to, thinking about, even in that case, right? I mean, the silliness of like the mechanism at the end of the day wasn't that important. But it really did come down to like, okay, but do we think we can do this for our customer, get them the outcome they want and, do it profitably so that we're not bleeding in the same moment, right? Like you come from that vantage point and then you can be honest about like, hey guys, I said yes, but let's be honest about what I just said yes to and like make sure that we're still on the right path to, 6 months from now when this thing wraps, like, are we going to be speaking the same language then? Right. Like right now it seems like we are, but are we going to still be saying the same thing then?
Yes. The honesty at all points there. That's absolutely right. I love the story. I think that, that moment probably, you being willing to ask that question and them being able to just kind of like let their hair down a little bit and be like, well, we thought that's how you guys did it over there. We thought that's what you wanted. If you don't like doing that, we don't like doing that either. It probably created some connection there, right? Like it probably allowed, for the relationship to build over that funny moment, right? Yep. Being honest builds connection. Being vulnerable builds connection. So, kind of bringing that full circle, that's usually the theme in all these things. Being willing to be vulnerable and honest builds that connection. So I'm going to kind of put a bow on this. We've talked about a few things here. We've talked about, having a fear of losing and making sure that you're not playing to lose. Anybody who's ever played anything competitively generally knows the moment you start playing that way, you're actually pointing yourself towards the thing you don't want as opposed to the thing that you do want. And it's generally a losing game. You can think of that in every interaction that you have with a person, with a customer, with a client, with your fellow workers. You want to make sure that you're playing to win. Don't play not to lose. Take the risk, the perceived risk of being honest and being vulnerable. Going so far as to say, you don't have anything to worry about being embarrassed, right? Be honest and you won't be embarrassed later. And lastly, it's not about you. You don't have to worry about feeling inferior. If you feel inferior, it's because you're thinking about yourself. So folks, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. We are going to be talking more about this book in the next episode. But until then, keep out serving your competition on your relentless pursuit to become an experienced leader.